arrested a contractor in the deaths of the pregnant woman and her husband. 6 months ago, the newlyweds were also expecting a baby.
My heart stopped. It was like it just turned into a rock, like a stone in my chest.
On the morning of March 12th, 2015, Christy picked up the phone and called her mother the way she did almost every single day. She laughed. She shared updates about the baby. She talked about the farm she and her husband were building together. It was an ordinary Wednesday. She had no idea it would be the last time her mother would ever hear her voice. Her full name was Christy Codd. She was 38 years old, 5 months pregnant with a baby girl she had already named Skylar. And by almost every measure, she was living the life she had always worked toward. Not handed to her, worked toward. Christy was the kind of woman who built things from scratch, who turned passion into purpose, and who somehow managed to make everyone around her feel like they were the most interesting person in the room. She was born into a military family, which meant that from the very beginning, stability was never guaranteed. Her father's service took the family from New Orleans, Louisiana, to Texas, then Illinois, then through several countries across Latin America. By the time Christy was a teenager, she had lived more lives than most people do in a lifetime. New schools, new cities, new languages Christy learned to adapt not just as a survival skill, but as a genuine gift. She spoke multiple languages. She understood culture not as a concept, but as something lived and breathed. And while other children her age were building decade-long friendships, Christy was learning something far more rare: how to walk into a room full of strangers and make it feel like home within minutes. It was not always easy. During her teenage years, the constant movement left its scars. Just when she would begin to find her footing, a lunch table that felt comfortable, a friend who truly understood her, the boxes would come out and the family would move again. She described this period of her life, according to those close to her, as deeply lonely at times. The smiling, charming girl that the world saw was also a young woman quietly learning how to cope with impermanence. But Christy never let loneliness define her. She channeled it into energy, into sport. She threw herself into gymnastics, swimming, and even kickboxing classes, physical disciplines that demanded focus and rewarded discipline. Her body became something she took pride in and cared for deeply, a relationship with health and fitness that would later become central to her identity and her career. When her father finally retired from the military and the family settled in Biloxi, Mississippi, something shifted in Christy. For the first time, she had ground beneath her feet that wasn't moving. She made real friends. She discovered a neighborhood, a routine, a sense of belonging. And it was here, in a kitchen in Mississippi, that she discovered the thing that would shape the rest of her life: cooking. It started simply, experimenting with ingredients, learning techniques, surprising her family with dishes that went far beyond what a teenager had any business making. But Christy's approach to food was never casual. She studied it the way she studied everything, with total commitment. She enrolled in culinary courses, absorbed everything she could, and began developing her own recipes, her own philosophy around food. Her parents assumed she would become a professional chef. The trajectory seemed obvious, but Christy was never obvious. She moved to Los Angeles and enrolled in an acting academy because she had discovered somewhat accidentally that she had a talent for performance. She appeared in commercials. She took the stage in theater productions. She worked as an extra and stunt performer on high-profile Hollywood sets, including a minor role within the Terminator franchise, performing stunts that required courage most people would walk away from. She was building something, a presence, a brand, a life that refused to fit into a single category. By 2000, she had graduated from the academy. The major acting roles had not yet come, but Christy was never the type to wait for someone else to open a door. She turned back to food, not as a fallback, but as a calling. She began appearing on culinary television shows, bringing with her the charisma and screen comfort she had developed as a performer. She made it to the finals of the Next Food Network Star, a run that announced her to hundreds of thousands of viewers across the country. She didn't win. The judges had mixed opinions on her culinary style, but Christy walked away from that experience with something more valuable than a trophy. She walked away with an audience. People followed her on social media in the thousands. They were drawn to her authenticity, her warmth, her genuine belief that food could be both nourishing and joyful. She promoted healthy living, designed her own exercise routines, gave nutritional advice, and built a community of people who trusted her. Then she built a catering company, one that specialized in healthy, thoughtfully prepared food for private events. It grew quickly. It reflected everything Christie believed in: quality ingredients, original recipes, food as an expression of care. She was already planning the next step: her own farm, growing produce that was clean and sustainable, expanding her business into something that felt truly whole. Christie was not perfect. No one who knew her would have said so, and she would have laughed at the suggestion. She was stubborn in her convictions. She chased too many ideas at once sometimes, spinning multiple projects simultaneously. She carried the restlessness of a military child who had never fully learned how to be still. But these were the textures of a real person, a woman who was always becoming something, always reaching. In August 2014, she married Joseph Timothy Codd JT, a casting director she had met at a studio audition in Los Angeles 2 years earlier. Their wedding was lavish and full of laughter, attended by hundreds of guests, including family, colleagues, neighbors, and fans. 3 months later, they learned they were expecting. They chose the name Skylar before they ever saw her face. By March 2015, Christie was 5 months along. She and JT had left Los Angeles behind entirely, trading California sunshine for a large piece of land in Lester, North Carolina, the beginning of that farm she had always envisioned. She called her mother almost every day. She was glowing, by all accounts, happy in the deep, settled way that takes years to arrive. She had a neighbor she trusted, a man who had helped them move in, who had sat at their wedding, who knew their dogs by name. She had no reason to be afraid. There is a particular kind of danger that wears the face of kindness. It does not announce itself. It does not arrive with warning signs visible to the naked eye. It shows up with a toolbox, offers to help you move furniture, sits at your wedding reception, and raises a glass in your honor. It learns your dog's names. It learns which door you leave unlocked. Robert Jason Owens was that kind of danger. He was 36 years old at the time Christie and JT Codd vanished from their home in Lester, North Carolina. On the surface, and the surface was all most people ever saw, Robert was unremarkable in the way that makes someone easy to overlook and easy to trust simultaneously. He was a handyman. He worked with his hands, fixed things, built things. He lived on the same street as the Codds. He had been one of the first people to welcome them when they moved into the neighborhood, helping them settle into their new home with the easy generosity of someone who had nothing to hide. He was invited to their wedding. Let that sit for a moment. Christie and JT looked at the people they loved most in the world, the people they wanted standing beside them on the most important day of their lives, and Robert Jason Owens was among them. That is not the story of a monster lurking at the edges. That is the story of a man who had inserted himself so completely into the fabric of their lives that his presence felt natural, even comforting. But the neighbors told a different story, or at least a more complicated one. Those who lived nearby described Owens as strange, unpredictable. There was something about him, they said, that was difficult to name precisely, a quality that made people slightly uneasy without being able to articulate why. He kept largely to himself beyond his relationship with the Codds. He was unmarried. He had no children. He maintained almost no contact with his own family. His social world was narrow, and the Codds sat at the very center of it. Robert had grown up in Asheville, North Carolina. Details about his early childhood remain limited in public records, but what is documented is a man who, by adulthood, existed largely outside the structures that anchor most people: no long-term partner, no close family network, no stable community beyond the occasional friendship he cultivated with particular intensity. Psychological profiles of individuals who commit crimes like the one Robert would eventually confess to often describe this pattern: the overinvestment in a single relationship or small social cluster, combined with an extreme and disproportionate response when that sense of connection feels threatened. What is documented is that Robert had been diagnosed with depression and was taking powerful psychiatric medication at the time of the crime. His legal team would later lean heavily on this fact, arguing that his mental state fundamentally impaired his judgment and his ability to fully comprehend his actions. Whether this explanation is genuine or convenient depends entirely on which side of the courtroom you were sitting on. What is not in dispute is his history. In January 2000, 15 years before Christy and JT disappeared, a young man named Zeb Wayne Quinn vanished from Asheville. He was 18 years old. He was undergoing military training. He worked part-time at Walmart to support himself. He was, by every account, a young man at the beginning of his life, full of potential, full of plans. Zeb and Robert had known each other since school. They were close. On the night of January 2nd, 2000, after Zeb finished his shift at Walmart, the two of them made plans to drive together to Leicester to look at a car Zeb was thinking of buying. It was an ordinary evening between old friends. Zeb Quinn was never seen again. His Mazda protege was found days later in another part of town, headlights still on, a heart drawn on the window in red lipstick, damage along the body of the car consistent with a collision. The paint embedded in those scratches matched Robert's vehicle. Robert's car bore corresponding damage. When questioned, Robert told investigators a story that struck them as deeply implausible, that Zeb had suddenly received a message on his pager, driven off to a payphone, returned looking frantic, announced their plans had changed, and then sped away into the night, clipping Robert's car as he left. Robert claimed he had no idea what happened after that. Investigators were skeptical. The evidence was circumstantial but pointed. A colleague at Walmart received a phone call the day after Zeb's disappearance from someone claiming to be Zeb, saying he wouldn't be in for a few days due to illness. The colleague found the voice strange, unfamiliar, not quite right. That call was later traced to the Volvo plant where Robert worked. When confronted, Robert admitted almost casually that he had made the call himself, at Zeb's request. The night before, Zeb allegedly drove away. There was no evidence to charge him. The case went cold. Zeb Quinn was listed as a missing person and largely forgotten by the machinery of law enforcement, though never by the people who loved him. Robert Owens moved on. In 2000, he purchased land in Leicester, North Carolina, the same town he and Zeb had been heading toward on the night Zeb disappeared. He built a house there. He established himself in the community as a handyman, a neighbor, a useful and seemingly harmless presence. He burned something in a fire pit on his property shortly after arriving, a fire that produced a smell so nauseating that his elderly neighbor confronted him about it. Robert offered a vague explanation. Shortly after, he covered the fire pit with concrete, claiming he planned to build a small fountain there. He never built the fountain. For 15 years, Robert Owens lived quietly in Leicester. He paid his bills. He fixed his neighbors' problems. He attended weddings. And whatever darkness lived inside him, whatever calculation or compulsion or cold indifference to human life had already expressed itself once remained hidden beneath the surface of an ordinary life. Then Christy and JT Codd moved onto his street. He helped them unpack. He learned the layout of their home. He knew which entrance was vulnerable, which rooms held valuables, which door could be forced. He knew their routines, their schedules, their habits. He knew they trusted him completely. In the weeks leading up to March 12th, 2015, nothing in Robert's outward behavior appeared to change. No dramatic shift, no visible unraveling. He remained what he had always appeared to be, a quiet, slightly odd, but fundamentally harmless neighbor. Christy was 5 months pregnant. She and JT were building their farm. They were happy. And Robert Owens was watching. On the evening of March 12th, 2015, he made a decision, or perhaps, as he would later claim, something simply happened. But the evidence that would emerge in the months that followed told a story far colder, far more deliberate than any accident. The Codd's dogs were still inside the house when investigators arrived. Fed, watered, locked in a room. Someone had taken care of them before leaving. There are days that exist in two versions. The version lived in real time, ordinary, unremarkable. full of small decisions that feel like nothing, and the version reconstructed afterward, when investigators and families and grief-stricken loved ones try to reassemble the hours like broken glass, desperate to understand exactly when everything went wrong. March 12th, 2015 exists in both versions. It was a Wednesday evening in Leicester, North Carolina. The air was cool, the neighborhood quiet in the way that small towns are quiet, not silent, but settled. Christy Codd had spoken to her mother earlier that day, the way she almost always did. The conversation was warm, unremarkable, full of the ordinary texture of a life going well. Christy talked about Skylar. She talked about the farm. She laughed at something her mother said. She hung up the phone and went about her evening. JT was home. The dogs were with them. The house on their nearly 1-acre plot in Leicester was the home they had chosen together, the place where they intended to build everything. Sometime that evening, according to Robert Jason Owens' own account, he drove toward the Codd residence. He claimed he had swerved to avoid a dog in the road, his vehicle sliding into the mud and becoming stuck. Unable to free the car himself, he walked to the one home on that street where he knew with absolute certainty he would be welcomed without question, the home of his friends. Christy and JT answered. This is where the story, even in Robert's own telling, becomes almost unbearable to sit with, because what happened next was not the result of strangers crossing paths in a dark alley. It was not random. It unfolded between people who knew each other, who had shared meals and celebrations, and ordinary Tuesday afternoons. Christy and JT did not hesitate. Of course they would help. That was who they were. That was who Christy had always been, the woman who found common ground with everyone, who made people feel seen, who responded to a person in need without calculating the cost. They went outside into the dark to help push Robert's car free. According to Robert, he was behind the wheel. Christy and JT were at the back of the vehicle, pushing. He claimed that in the chaos and the darkness, he confused the accelerator for the brake, and the car lurched backward, striking them both. What happened in those seconds, whether it was truly an accident or something far more deliberate, is something only Robert Owens knows with certainty. What the evidence would later reveal is that whatever occurred on that road, what followed was not the behavior of a man in shock. What followed was not panic, not desperate grief, not a person overwhelmed by a terrible accident reaching immediately for his phone to call for help. What followed was calculation. Robert did not call 911. He did not call an ambulance. He did not knock on a neighbor's door or flag down a passing car. Instead, according to his own confession, he made a decision in those dark minutes on that quiet road, a decision that would define everything that came after. He decided that no one could know what had happened. He returned to the Codd home. He forced open the back door, the lock splintering under pressure, and moved through the house that he knew as well as his own. He went to the bedroom. He gathered blankets. He returned to where Christy and JT lay on the road. He wrapped them. He loaded them into the bed of his pickup truck. He drove them to his own home. What Robert Owens did next, in his own bathroom, using a saw and a small axe, is documented in court records and confirmed by forensic evidence. It is described here not to satisfy morbidity, but because the truth of what Christy and JT endured, or more precisely, what was done to them, is part of their story, and erasing it would be its own kind of violence against their memory. He dismembered their bodies. Then he carried them, piece by piece, to his wood-burning stove, and he fed the fire through the night. Christy was 5 months pregnant. Skylar, the daughter they had already named, already imagined, already loved, was gone with her mother in that darkness. The blood-soaked blankets, the clothing, the footwear, Robert chose not to burn these. Instead, he packed them into a large trash bag, walked to the bins near the Codd residence, and disposed of them, confident that once the trash reached the landfill, nothing would ever be recovered. He then returned to the Codd home and staged what appeared to be a burglary, taking a jewelry box and breaching the safe in the bedroom, stealing money and valuables which he would pawn the very next day. Before he left, someone fed the dogs and locked them safely in a room. The detail is almost impossible to process. In the middle of everything, the fire still burning, his friends reduced to fragments, Robert Owens paused to make sure their dogs were taken care of. Whether this reflects some fractured remnant of conscience or simply the behavior of a man methodically eliminating evidence of their presence in the home is impossible to say. But it is one of the details that stayed with investigators long after the case was closed. For 3 days, the phones rang unanswered. Christy's mother tried every morning, then twice a day, then constantly. JT's phone went to voicemail. Christy's rang, and then, on March 15th, went silent entirely, the battery dead, the device sitting untouched on a surface inside a house that felt increasingly wrong. On March 15th, Christy's mother called her daughter's close friend, Cecily, who lived nearby, and asked her to check on the house. Cecily drove over and found exactly the kind of scene that transforms worry into dread. Both cars were in the driveway. The front door was locked. No one answered knocks or shouts. Through a window, she could see the dogs alive, contained, waiting. She walked around to the back of the house and found the door. The lock had been forced. Cecily called Christy's mother immediately. Christy's mother called the police. When officers arrived and entered the home, they found the interior in disarray, drawers pulled open, items displaced, the safe in the bedroom breached. They found no blood, no signs of a struggle, no evidence that the Cods had been harmed inside their own home. They found no Christy, no JT, no explanation. The investigation was opened. The community of Leicester small, interconnected, the kind of place where everyone knows which cars belong in which driveways, absorbed the news with the particular horror that comes not from distance, but from proximity. These were not strangers. These were neighbors. The pregnant woman on the street who waved from her porch, the couple who had just started building their farm. And somewhere on that same street, Robert Jason Owens watched the police tape go up and said nothing. He had already taken out his trash. Every investigation has a moment, a single pivot point where the scattered pieces of an impossible puzzle suddenly begin to align, where one detail, one witness, one discarded bag of evidence pulls the entire case from darkness into something resembling clarity. In the investigation into the disappearance of Christy and JT Cod, that moment came from a trash bag at a landfill. But the road to that moment was not simple. When officers first entered the Cod residence on March 15, 2015, what they found was a scene designed to mislead. The forced back door, the rifled drawers, the breech safe. Every element pointed toward a burglary gone wrong, a random intrusion by unknown individuals who had perhaps surprised the couple and taken them somewhere against their will. It was a narrative that raised terrible possibilities, but offered investigators almost nothing concrete to pursue. The couple's phones had last been used on March 12th. Only incoming calls were recorded that day. After that, silence. The devices had been left inside the home, their batteries eventually dying where they sat untouched, undisturbed, as though Christy and JT had simply stepped outside and never come back. There were no fingerprints inside the home that shouldn't have been there, no DNA, no blood, no sign of struggle. Whoever had entered through that back door had been extraordinarily careful, moving through the house with a methodical precision that left investigators with almost nothing to build on. The missing couple had no known enemies, no disputes with neighbors, no financial conflicts, no threatening relationships. They were, by every account, a couple who had deliberately built a quiet, purposeful life, far from the complications of Los Angeles. There was no obvious thread to pull. Investigators turned to the neighborhood. Door-to-door questioning in a small community like Leicester is a particular kind of exercise, intimate, sometimes uncomfortable, always revealing in ways that extend beyond the specific answers given. People notice things in small towns. They notice which cars are parked where, which lights are on at unusual hours, which neighbors behave in ways that are slightly but meaningfully different from their established patterns. One neighbor came forward with a detail that seemed minor at first, but would prove decisive. On the morning of March 15th, the same morning, Cecily would arrive to find the Cod home empty, and the back door forced this neighbor had watched Robert Jason Owens carry a large bundle to a trash bin near the Cod residence and dispose of it. At the time, the neighbor had thought nothing of it. People take out their trash. It was an ordinary gesture in an ordinary morning. But once word spread that Christy and JT were missing, once the police tape went up and the questions began, that image of Robert and his bundle began to feel different. The neighbor told investigators what he had seen. Police moved immediately to recover the contents of that bin. They were too late. The trash had already been collected and transported to the local landfill. Investigators redirected their attention there, dispatching officers to search through the collected waste for anything connected to the Cod home. They found it. Inside a large trash bag recovered from the landfill were items that had come from the Cod residents' clothing belonging to Christy and JT, a blanket, a throw from their home. The items were partially burned. They were saturated with blood, and on them, clear and unambiguous, were Robert Jason Owens' fingerprints and DNA traces. The investigation shifted instantly. On March 16th, Robert was brought to the police station for questioning. He arrived calmly, presenting the demeanor of a cooperative neighbor eager to assist. He denied any involvement in the couple's disappearance. He denied knowledge of the bundle. He was measured, composed, and to investigators who had seen the landfill, evidence transparently false. But they needed more before they could hold him. That evening, they got it. A search warrant for Robert's property was executed, and officers entered his home on the same quiet street where Christy and JT had been building their dream. What they found there transformed the investigation from a missing persons case into something far darker. In Robert's wood-burning stove, investigators discovered charred human skeletal remains. In his bathroom, they found evidence consistent with dismemberment, blood, biological material, the physical traces of what had been done there. On a surface in the home, not hidden, not cleaned, not even particularly concealed, they found a saw and a small axe, both stained with blood, skin, and bone fragments belonging to the missing couple. Robert had not bothered to clean them. He had been confident, investigators concluded, that the crime scene at the Cod home was clean enough to ensure the trail would never lead back to him. He was wrong. Forensic analysis confirmed that the bone fragments recovered from the stove belonged to Christy and JT Cod. The evidence was overwhelming, devastating, and complete. Robert was taken into custody as a suspect in their murders. For several hours, he maintained his denials. Then, piece by piece, his account began to shift. He confessed, but the confession itself was a study in the particular way some individuals construct narratives around their own culpability. He admitted to the deaths. He insisted they were accidental. He described the car, the mud, the darkness, the confusion of pedals, a story that explained the deaths as a terrible mishap and everything that followed as the panicked response of a man too frightened to call for help. Investigators listened. They documented, and they began quietly pulling the threads of Robert's past. What they found was Zeb Wayne Quinn. The 15-year-old disappearance of Robert's childhood friend was pulled from the archives and re-examined with new urgency. When investigators searched Robert's property more thoroughly, they discovered a sealed concrete slab in a detached area of the property, a slab poured back in 2000, shortly after Robert purchased the land. Beneath it, in a walled-off cavity, were small, heavily charred human bone fragments. The remains were too damaged for DNA analysis, but the context was shattering. A neighboring elderly man remembered a fire on Robert's property in January 2000. He remembered the smell sweet, nauseating, wrong in a way that had stayed with him even 15 years later. He remembered confronting Robert about it. He remembered the concrete being poured shortly after. In 2017, facing charges of first-degree double murder, murder of an unborn child, dismemberment, concealment of evidence, burglary, and robbery charges that collectively carried the possibility of the death penalty, Robert Jason Owens entered a plea agreement. He admitted guilt in the murders of Christy and JT Cod in exchange for the removal of the death penalty from consideration. He was convicted of second-degree manslaughter, dismemberment and incineration of bodies, burglary, and robbery. He was sentenced to 59 years in prison. In 2022, he entered a second plea agreement regarding Zeb Quinn's case, admitting only to complicity in murder and assisting in concealing evidence. constructing a story that placed the primary responsibility on his deceased uncle Walter Owens, a man no longer alive to contradict him. For this, he received an additional 12 years, added to a sentence that already ensured he would die behind bars. When the verdict was delivered in the Cod case, Christie's family sat in that courtroom and heard the word guilty. They heard the sentence. They had fought for more, for first-degree murder, for the full weight of what had been taken from them to be reflected in what Robert received. The plea agreement gave them something, but not everything. Christie's mother, who had called her daughter almost every single day of her life, who had heard Christie's voice for the last time on March 12th, without knowing it was the last time sat in that courtroom and watched the man who had burned her daughter and her unborn granddaughter receive his sentence. No verdict restores what was taken. No number of years given back the morning phone calls, the farm that never got built, the daughter named Skylar who never drew her first breath. But Robert Jason Owens will die in prison, and Christie's name is still spoken. After the courtroom empties, after the verdict is read and the sentence handed down, after the cameras stop recording and the reporters file their final stories, the people left behind must figure out how to carry something that was never meant to be carried. There is no manual for surviving the murder of someone you loved. There is no clean timeline for grief that has been compounded by violence, by violation, by the particular cruelty of knowing exactly what was done and being unable to unknow it. Christy Codd's family has had to learn to live inside that knowledge every single day since March 2015. Christy's mother, the woman who called her daughter almost every morning, who sometimes talked with her for an hour at a time about recipes and babies and the farm and the future, lost not just a daughter on March 12, 2015. She lost the rhythm of her own days. She lost the voice that had been woven into the ordinary fabric of her mornings for nearly 4 decades. She lost Skylar, a granddaughter she had already begun to love, already begun to imagine, a child who had already been given a name and a future and a place in the family's story before she ever had the chance to arrive. Grief of this magnitude does not resolve. It does not follow the stages that textbooks describe in their tidy, sequential order. It mutates. It finds you in grocery stores when you pass a cooking show playing on a display screen. It finds you in August when the anniversary of a wedding you attended full of joy becomes something else entirely. It finds you in the silence where a phone call used to be. Christy's parents, her friends, her extended network of followers and admirers who had watched her build her life online, all of them were left to reconcile the image of the vibrant, laughing, deeply alive woman they had known with the unbearable facts of what had been done to her. JT's family carried their own version of this weight. A son, a former husband, a man who had found in Christy something that had restored his faith and love after a difficult first marriage gone, not peacefully, not with dignity, but in the most violent and dehumanizing way imaginable, on a quiet road in North Carolina, on an otherwise ordinary Wednesday night. The community of Leicester absorbed the case in the complicated way that small towns absorb atrocity, with a mixture of grief, disbelief, and the unsettling realization that the danger had lived among them, had walked their streets, had been present at events they themselves had attended. Robert Owens had not been a shadow at the edges of their world. He had been woven into it. And that knowledge changed something permanently, not just about how residents saw their neighborhood, but about how they understood the nature of trust itself. There is a particular wound that comes from betrayal by someone considered a friend. It is different from the wound inflicted by a stranger. It carries with it a retroactive contamination. Every shared meal, every kind gesture, every moment of genuine seeming warmth becomes suspect in retrospect, re-examined for signs that should have been visible, for warnings that were somehow missed. The neighbors of Leicester, the friends of the Codd family, have had to live with that retroactive contamination for years. For the family of Zeb Wayne Quinn, the case reopened wounds that had never fully closed. Zeb had been missing for 15 years when Robert's arrest brought his name back into public conversation. 15 years of not knowing, of hoping against hope, of anniversaries marked without answers, of a young man frozen at 18 years old, in the memories of everyone who loved him while the world continued without him. When Robert's second plea deal in 2022 finally produced an admission of complicity in Zeb's death, it offered something, a fragment of acknowledgement, a confirmation of what the family had long suspected, but it also confirmed the worst. Zeb had not simply disappeared. He had been taken, deliberately, by someone he trusted, on a night that had begun as an ordinary drive between friends. The bone fragments discovered beneath the concrete on Robert's property, too damaged for DNA confirmation, remain officially unidentified. Zeb Quinn remains listed in records as a missing person. His family has never received the full truth, because the man who holds it constructed a story designed to distribute blame onto someone who cannot speak, and delivered that story in exchange for a legal arrangement that benefited no one but himself. This is one of the most painful realities the justice system produces: the plea deal as transaction. Robert Owens avoided the death penalty in the Codd case by admitting to a lesser version of what the evidence suggested he had done. He avoided a full murder conviction in the Quinn case by admitting only to complicity and deflecting primary responsibility onto his deceased uncle. The families of both cases have publicly stated that they do not believe his version of events. They do not believe the car accident story. They do not believe the uncle story. They believe, and the weight of circumstantial evidence supports them, that Robert Jason Owens is a man who has killed more than once, deliberately, and who has used every legal mechanism available to him to minimize the consequences. Christie's family has never accepted the term unintentional. They have said so clearly and repeatedly. The man who, after allegedly causing an accident, chose not to call for help, chose instead to return to his friend's home, break in, gather blankets, transport two bodies, dismember them with a saw and an axe, burn them through the night, stage a burglary, pawn stolen valuables the following morning, and feed the dogs before leaving, that man, they have argued, was not acting from panic. He was acting from plan. The courts, through the mechanics of plea agreements and legal strategy, produced a sentence that will keep Robert Owens incarcerated for the rest of his natural life. He is currently serving 71 combined years in a North Carolina correctional facility. He will die there. Whatever comfort that provides, and it provides some, though never enough, it is the reality. In 2017, after delivering his statement to the court, Robert Owens addressed the families directly. He asked for forgiveness. He spoke again of his mental illness, of the medication that he claimed had clouded his judgment, of the accident he insisted had set everything in motion. The family sat and listened and did not give him what he asked for. They owed him nothing. What this case reveals, and it reveals several things simultaneously, is the particular vulnerability that comes with trust. Christy and JT Codd were not careless people. They were not naive. They were thoughtful, health-conscious, community-minded individuals who had deliberately chosen a quieter life, who had welcomed a neighbor into their home and their celebrations, because that is what decent people do. They were not undone by bad judgment. They were undone by the calculated presentation of a man who had learned, possibly over decades and possibly through prior practice, how to appear trustworthy. It also reveals the gaps that exist in how missing persons cases involving adults are initially treated. The hours lost before concern becomes action, the threshold of proof required before law enforcement can move with urgency. Christy's mother spent 3 days unable to reach her daughter before anyone physically checked on the house. 3 days in which the evidence was being burned, disposed of, scattered. Whether earlier intervention would have changed the outcome is impossible to say. But the question lingers. And it reveals something about the justice system's relationship with mental illness as a legal defense. The complicated, unresolved tension between genuine psychiatric suffering and the use of documented mental health history as a mechanism for sentence reduction. Robert Owens had real diagnoses. He took real medication. Whether those diagnoses explain or merely contextualize his actions is a question that psychiatrists, legal scholars, and grieving families answer very differently. Christy Codd deserved her farm. She deserved to watch Skylar take her first steps across the land they were cultivating together, to teach her daughter to cook the way she herself had learned experimentally, joyfully, with complete commitment. She deserved more mornings on the phone with her mother. She deserved the ordinary accumulation of years that most of us take entirely for granted. She was a military child who learned to make home wherever she landed. She was a culinary artist who believed food was an expression of care. She was a performer, an entrepreneur, a wife, a daughter, a friend, and for 5 months, she was a mother, fiercely and completely, and with everything she had. She was real. She was here. She mattered beyond her disappearance, beyond the case number assigned to her death, beyond the documentary scripts and the true crime discussions, and the inevitable reduction of a full human life into a series of tragic facts. Her name was Christy Codd. She was building something beautiful when it was taken from her. The farm never got finished. The fountain was never built. But her name is still spoken by her mother, by her friends, by everyone who refuses to let her become only a story about how she died, rather than a celebration of how completely, how generously, how stubbornly alive she was. Skylar never got her name called at a school roll. Christy never got to hear it. The world is immeasurably less warm without them both in it.